All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. We always love when February rolls along. Every February at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, we kick all the men out for the month, and we host exclusively women in science, adventure, exploration, and conservation from all over the world. So it's been a busy month already. We've got about 30 events already taken care of, and we've got maybe 15 to 20 more before the month comes to an end. So we're going to keep things rolling along today. We're really excited to have Grace Young joining us. She's an avid sailor and diver. She's participated in marine expeditions on 4 continents. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Mechanical and Ocean Engineering at MIT, and her work experience includes helping to design, build, and test submersible and aerial robots that have been deployed in the Arctic, Antarctic, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. In 2014, she was an aquanaut on Fabien Cousteau's Mission 31, living and working on the ocean floor for 2 weeks in the Aquarius Reef base. And she's even spent a summer working at NASA's Frontier Development Lab, creating 3D models of asteroids. So Grace, it's always a pleasure to have you hanging out with us. We're excited to get to know you a little bit better today.
Thanks, Joe. I'm excited to be here.
All right, awesome. So you're joining us from California today. So I'm looking out my window and there's like, I don't know, 4-foot mounds of snow. So I'm imagining you're seeing a little bit of a different landscape.
No, it's nice and sunny outside. It's gorgeous today. Sorry, Joe.
All right, fair enough. Well, I'm going to let you take over for a little bit and then we'll do a little Q&A action.
Great. So I thought today I would share a couple stories and show, I think the images I have from underwater really help explain the situation. So I'll show some images and tell some stories for about 20 minutes or a half hour. And then what I enjoy most is getting to answer and hear your questions from the classrooms. So please, while I'm speaking, come up with questions. And then as you ask your question, you could say where you're from and what grade you're in. That would be really great. I've noticed it's sometimes awkward to interrupt the presentation with questions, even though I normally like that in person. So if you just want to hold them to the end, that'd be good. But if you can't see something or can't hear me somehow, Joe, you'll flag it down, right? Cool. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Yes. All right. You see this picture of the world?
We got it.
All right. I love showing this picture of our Earth because it stresses how much of the world's surface the ocean covers. It's 71% of our planet, and I think we so easily forget that because most of us spend all our time on land. Another thing this reminds me of is, well, that a lot of people are really scared of the ocean. So a survey came out and said 2/3 of Americans are scared of open water. And you may have heard the statistic that we haven't seen 95% of the ocean, or 95% is unexplored. And I keep thinking, how are we going to explore it if people are just terrified of the blue space that makes our planet so unique? Here's a picture of me when I was really little. I grew up in Ohio and Michigan, 2 states that you wouldn't associate with the ocean necessarily because they're quite landlocked. And yet I was surrounded by the Great Lakes and by lakes. So I grew up sailing on the lakes, spending time on the lakes, boating, swimming. I was on the swim team. And for me, that started my love of being in the water. And then when my family moved to Washington, D.C., I was sailing on the Chesapeake Bay. And in college, I joined the sailing team, and my love and appreciation for the ocean was really cemented by the time I got to college. In high school, I was determined to earn my master scuba diver license by the age of 15. So I learned to scuba dive with a family friend. And at MIT, I joined the sailing team. I loved anything that got me, again, on, in, or near the water. Today, too, I want to share some stories from, I think, one of the most exciting times of my life, and that was right as I was graduating college. So in high school, I was involved in my school's robotics team. It was a brand new thing at the time. We did FIRST and VEX robotics competitions. And that was the first time I realized what engineering was. I learned that I really enjoyed it, and it was something that I was good at. I'd always liked my science and math classes too. But that robotics team was my first exposure to real engineering. And now that I work professionally as an engineer, I think that my time on robotics team and working on projects with people has prepared me best for this career in engineering, even more so than a lot of the classes I took. And I took some really good classes at MIT and in high school. So going back for a second, going into college, I knew I wanted to study engineering and do something robotics related. And then I explored different majors. I looked into physics and computer science. And then when I learned that ocean engineering was a major, I thought that sounds like the most fun. It perfectly combines my passions for the ocean and robotics and engineering. And so once I found that, I was pretty much hooked. And through undergrad, I worked on a number of marine robotics projects through internships in the summer or research projects working with labs during the school year. And with the marine robotics projects, almost all of the robots have camera systems on them or are taking images. And usually we would come back from an expedition with a folder full of tens of thousands of images. And we would need to process them to find patterns from the images and what we're learning. And that requires somewhat sophisticated image processing and data analysis tools. So that's how I, in some ways, shifted from marine robotics broadly into specifically camera systems and image processing systems. And that's what I work on today. So coming all together, in 2014, I was at MIT working on underwater camera systems, and I met Fabien Cousteau, Jacques Cousteau's grandson, and he was organizing an expedition to live on the seafloor for 30 days, just like his grandfather did 50 years prior. And his grandfather had worked with an MIT scientist developing, at the time, cutting-edge underwater cameras. And so we worked together, Fabien and I, to do the next generation of sophisticated underwater camera systems. And we did that by working on the seafloor in this habitat called Aquarius. This somewhat blurry photo shows the habitat. A lot of people mistake it for a submarine. They say it's a submarine, but it's quite different for a couple of reasons. One, it's bolted to the seafloor, unlike a submarine. And two, inside the habitat, the air is the same pressure as the water around it. At this depth, we were breathing about 2 or 3 atmospheres of pressure, versus a submarine is kept at 1 atmosphere, the same atmosphere we're all breathing now. And what that high pressure air meant was that we could leave the habitat as we pleased and spend most of the day diving in the water, doing experiments in the water. Another comment I get too is that this habitat looks like kind of old and rusty. It's been underwater for 27 years now, so it is kind of old for a piece of underwater technology. But the fact that it's covered in marine life, algae, sponges, even some coral and shrimps it's a good thing. It shows that it's starting to become part of the underwater landscape and the underwater ecosystem. Here, this is a picture of me in my dive helmet. We were doing hard hat diving, and that hose you see coming off me is supplying air to my helmet. Underwater, I started to feel like a marine animal. People always ask, what was it like? What did you feel like? And I say I would go back in a heartbeat. It's amazing spending 8 hours a day in the water, which hardly anyone gets to do. I really started to become like a marine animal myself. Here's another photo. I'm standing on top of our emergency air supply cylinders. And these eagle rays, which are one of my favorite animals, they're kept circling the habitat day to day. And of course, if I was doing normal scuba dives, just visiting the site once a day max, I probably wouldn't have noticed this rhythmic pattern that the eagle rays had circling the habitat every day. Here's one of those spotted eagle rays gliding up past the viewport in our bunk room in the habitat. And here, this is me and my aquanaut buddy, Liz McGee. We were doing a research experiment collecting plankton samples for a graduate student. So every morning we would set up these nets that collected plankton at the top of them. And then at night we would collect the samples for the student to organize. And what we were looking at was differences in plankton communities and how that changes between day and night over the course of several days. Here, Liz and I, we were studying the sponges on the reef. So there was a group that's making a library of sponge DNA, and we collect small samples for that DNA library. These giant barrel sponges, they filter gallons and gallons, enormous amounts of water every day, and that helps keep the reefs clean. They also provide a 3D structure that can become home to other organisms on the reef. So they're really important ancient organisms that are still quite a mystery to us. And here we are operating that underwater camera that I had worked on. So this camera was special because it films in ultra slow motion. This camera could film at up to 18,000 frames per second, whereas a normal camera films at about 30 frames a second, and the slow motion setting on an iPhone is 240 frames a second or 700 frames per second. And what this means is that we could film animals that move really, really fast, faster than our human eye can see. We could film them in slow motion and start to see what kinds of movements they're doing. In this photo, we are holding the camera and we were filming these soft coral polyps feeding. They have little arms that they'll use to grab food out of the water, but they do it really fast, so you can't see unless you're able to slow down the footage. That video shows me, I was brushing my teeth at the sink, and the sink is right by a viewport, and there's a big school of fish outside. It felt so surreal to be brushing my teeth next to a school of fish. Here's the floor plan of the habitat too. The habitat was about the size of a yellow school bus, so we were definitely cozy. There were 6 of us living in there at the time. And you can see it's laid out a little bit like an RV. I describe it as the combination of an RV and a space station. There are 6 bunks in the back room. We had a small table and kitchen, and the table was where we would have meals and where we would sit and do work on our laptops. And then we had an entry lock. Another question I get often is, how does the door work in the habitat? And it's amazingly simple. All we had as our door was a hole in the floor, essentially. So there's an opening in the habitat. This photo shows it here with, I think, Sylvia Earle in the photo. And the air pressure inside the habitat keeps the water at bay. So to enter the habitat, we just go underneath and through this water air barrier. I say it's like a bucket flipped upside down and pushed underwater. There's a bubble of air that stays constant there, and that's how we get in and out of the habitat. This photo is of my aquanaut buddy Liz, and she's staring eye to eye with a Goliath grouper. This is a fish that can be up to 300 pounds. They're massive fish. They're endangered right now in Florida, and they are still quite mysterious. We brought down this camera because divers have reported hearing a boom in their chest when the grouper feeds around them. And the theory is that the grouper is making a cavitation bubble in its throat. And the bubble, when it collapses, could be stunning prey around it. And it could use that to stun prey and then more easily come in and swoop its prey. We thought we might be able to film this really quick bubble forming action with the high-speed camera that I brought down. And we did. It took a while. It took an hour or so being underwater with this fish for it to become comfortable coming up to us. And it came and would just stare at us and make eye contact with us. And it did boom right in front of Liz, but its mouth is so tight and closed. We realized, we would have to get the camera like inside its mouth to film that, and it just wasn't possible. But we did get a lot of other incredible footage of animals moving really fast underwater. This photo is again Liz and I am upside down on my head. Believe it or not, that was really comfortable underwater because those helmets that we were diving in were 30 pounds plus negative underwater. And so the kind of natural thing, if I was going to relax, was to let my head fall to the sand and then my legs would float up in my neoprene suit. And because we were diving for like sometimes 8 hours a day, I got into the habit of every 2 hours or so taking a break, letting my head fall and letting my head legs float up. And it was while I was doing this, while I was staring at a patch of sand for literally 30 seconds, that I realized I was staring right at a mantis shrimp. Mantis shrimp, they're about the diameter of a quarter. And this one was very camouflaged in the sand. They're known for moving really fast, leaping out of their dens to feed. And so we brought over I marked the spot with a rock. We came back with a high-speed camera and filmed the mantis feeding. This is the first time a mantis shrimp was filmed in its natural habitat. And here, this video is in ultra slow motion. We see a goby swimming by and the mantis leaps out of its den to catch its prey. You can get a sense for how slow this is by seeing how that sand is moving around the mantis, moving really slow. This was about 2,000 frames per second. In real time, when I was watching this with my own eyes, I didn't know what happened. It just like in a blink of an eye, the mantis was there and then it looked like it had gone in its den. I didn't actually realize we captured it feeding or eating something until Fabien, who was in the habitat controlling the camera, said, "Hey, I think you got something." Here's another animal we filmed. This is it's called a lizardfish, and it's coming out of camouflage. Again, this happens so fast. So I saw this from a distance. I saw like a poof of sand every so often, and it looked to me like a ghost was walking on the seafloor, leaving footprints. But upon closer look and seeing the scene in really slow motion, we saw that it was this lizardfish perfectly coming out of the sand by making two S shapes and shaking the sand off of its body. After Mission 31, I did my PhD at Oxford on underwater imaging technology. For that, I did a type of diving called rebreather diving, where instead of breathing in air and then releasing it all as bubbles, you essentially breathe the same breath over and over, but the machine adds oxygen as we metabolizes it, and then takes out the carbon dioxide, which we don't want to breathe again. Here's a photo of me and my 3 dive buddies on our rebreather units. It's always funny because all of us, look really different in real life, but even my own mom couldn't necessarily tell which one was me in some of these diving photos. Here, this shows one of my earliest computational photography research projects related to ballet dance. I danced up until I started college. I did ballet classes for a really long time. And in ballet, one of the most fundamental but difficult moves is a pirouette turn. That's what this dancer is doing here. And it's very hard to correct yourself to know what part of your alignment in a turn could be off and could be preventing you from completing several turns. So I worked with the Microsoft Kinect system to image the dancer and it tracked dots on each point in your body, the head, the torso, the knees, and you could see more clearly then where you were getting off in your alignment. And this spurred me then to work on other imaging projects, which led to my work in my PhD, making 3D models of coral reefs, and some of my work now. I always say we have so much to learn about the ocean still. Like each of you, I could unlock a new mystery about the ocean. This photo, we put that high-speed camera against the viewport of the habitat at night. And these are all of the tiny organisms feeding and against the viewport at night. I showed this to an expert who studies microorganisms in the ocean, and she couldn't identify all of these. Some of these could be new. We have so little understanding of what they really do. Another time too, I was studying in my thesis Bryozoans, which is an organism that looks a bit like coral. And I got to go behind the scenes at the Natural History Museum in London. And he was showing me some samples of the bryozoans. And he was showing one drawer had a type of bryozoan that they're now using in clinical trials for a new cancer treatment drug. But there were hundreds of drawers of these things. And I said, oh, well, what about these other species in the other drawers? And he said, I mean, no one has looked. No one has looked to really understand those organisms. Last summer, I was in a documentary with National Geographic talking about ancient coral reefs. This came out of a collaboration I had with a fellow National Geographic explorer, Federico Fanti. He is a paleontologist and geologist. He finds dinosaur fossils all around the world. And he had been talking to me about going diving on an ancient coral reef. And I'm also working on a submarine. I work on underwater technology. So in my head, when he said that, I thought, oh, we'll scuba dive or take the submarine down to one of these ancient reefs. But really, the ancient reef was the mountain range in Italy. It's called the Dolomites. And this mountain range, they look kind of like normal mountains. People ski on them in the winter, but they're all made up of fossilized coral. And we looked at the history of that reef, how it had built up and died and built up and died over the course of millions of years. And we showed how, here's me holding a fossilized coral reef. We showed how that is similar to modern day coral reefs, especially coral reefs that are affected by volcanic activity, say in the Caribbean island of Montserrat, and then a coral reef in Tanzania, which is in shallow or murky water. In Montserrat too, it was a beautiful example of how we sometimes need to be patient with nature. So for example, they had a volcano that erupted about 10 years ago, and it suffocated the reefs around it in the path of the volcano. But we've already started to see reefs and coral growing back on top of that ash. It did take 10 years, but here is a small coral about the size of a ping pong ball growing on top of that ash. And something I did there is I made 3D models of those growing corals so that researchers can track the coral growth. Here's one of the healthier corals around Montserrat. Great. And that's what I wanted to share.
All right. Thanks so much, Grace. Thanks for sharing some of your story and some of the work that you've been working on the last few years. You've definitely had a variety of experiences, and yeah, we're excited to see what comes next.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, very cool. We've got a great group of classrooms joining us today in Canada and the US. We've got more tuning in live via YouTube as well. But let's start taking some questions from our camera classrooms. So let's see, let's start in Canton. I believe it's Canton, Michigan. We've got Mrs. Edwards' group hanging out with us. Let's get that microphone turned on. There it is. How we doing, Canton?
We're in Canton, Illinois, actually.
Oh, Illinois. Well, I took a stab at it, but I was off by a state or two. All right. Well, we're ready for you. Who's got a question?
Right. We are a third grade classroom, so we look a little younger than some of the ones that I saw.
I'm small for my age.
You're small.
I'm 9 years old.
Let's take a question from Anna Brown. What is your question?
Nice and loud for us.
Yep, nice and loud, Anna. Just go right up there. Okay. You should be good. All right.
Right here.
Anna. Squat down so she can see you. Okay. There you go.
The question is, how many robotics did you make for one type of species?
Ooh, how many robots to study one type of species? I haven't built a robot to study one particular species, although I do know some people who have. I know, for example, at MIT, researchers built a robotic tuna, and they were studying how that tuna might be able to school with real life tuna. But my camera systems have mostly looked at whatever species they can encounter or come near, from the tiny ones like those ones I showed against the window to the Mantis Shrimp, which are a bit larger.
All right, great question to get us started. We're going to go a little closer to you, Grace. We have some students hanging out with Mrs. Stuber, and they are in Whittier, California. Let me get that microphone turned on. There we go. How we doing, boys and girls?
Good.
Questions, anyone?
My question is, how was I gonna say this? When you started working with underwater tech, as far as like the cameras and imagery, like were you able to find anything new as far as like new discoveries of underwater species?
Ooh, new species. I think that studying the behavior of the animals was new because some of those animals, like the mantis shrimp, like the lizardfish, they move too fast for our eyes to see and comprehend. Being able to slow down their motion at a speed where we can comprehend what they're doing, that was a big discovery. And so was being able to film them in ways where they were comfortable with us being around them. Normally at the depth we were living in that habitat, so about 20 meters, you'd only have a 45 minutes to dive, and 45 minutes just isn't enough for organisms to become accustomed to your presence, that you get close enough to set up a camera and film them. Like to film that mantis shrimp, we had set up the camera, which because that was a complicated camera, took a half hour or 45 minutes. And then we sat there patiently waiting for it to feed for about 2 hours. And so on a normal dive, we just wouldn't have enough time to observe that behavior. And so having the time and having the technology then to understand the behavior was a big discovery. I haven't discovered any new species, but my PhD advisor has discovered several. And for him, it was funny. It's almost, he's like tired of it. He's named them after his wife and after people he cares about. And almost any deep sea cruise he comes back from, they've discovered new species. We had in our lab, we had just jars of specimens then, and we were in a room full of them. And he just said, there's probably new species in these jars. So we haven't had someone to do the work of identifying them and cataloging it and doing the DNA analysis to show that for sure it's a new species.
I think it would surprise a lot of students to know too, that it's not just a matter of looking at something and say, hey, there's a new species. It's actually a multi-year process in a lot of cases before you can say, yep, we have a new species here. Yeah,
to be sure, you do a genetic study, compare it to known organisms, and then also study the taxonomy of the species and try to really fully define it.
All right, we're going to take a little trip to Chesapeake, Virginia. 7th graders hanging out with Mrs. Deer. Let me get that microphone turned on. There we go. How are we doing, Virginia?
Hey there, we're doing well. Do they see me yet? I'm here. Awesome. Right there. Introduce yourself. Oh, I'm Ashlyn. I live in Chesapeake.
Cool.
Have you used, what'd you write down? Have you surveyed any species in Chesapeake Bay?
Oh, Chesapeake Bay, yes.
Yes.
So my family's in Annapolis, so I know the Bay. I did, when I was in 8th grade, I did a Chesapeake Bay trip with my school. It was with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And the trip was just, I think it was just 1 week or 2 weeks, but I remember it so well, and it definitely cemented my interest in marine life. So on that trip, we studied crab pods. We looked at birds on this island. We were collecting fish specimens and then putting them back. Yeah, that's what I remember. It was a bit ago, but I remember thinking like that was really cool, and I wanted to do that again. I'm also fascinated by oysters and oysters in the bay because they do such a tremendous job at filtering the water of the bay. They also, because they stay stuck in the soil, they help prevent erosion on the coastline. And so I always say we need to be careful about what kinds of seafood we eat and make sure it was harvested sustainably. But usually bivalves like oysters are a good bet because no matter how you farm them, they're usually good that they were there in the ecosystem. And so I'm fascinated too by the oysters in the bay. And I think there's some projects that are restoring oyster beds in the bay. I'm very supportive of that.
All right. So we're going to go now. I think we'll go to Freehold, New Jersey this time, mostly because I see someone in blue who's kind of dancing. Looks like they're ready. They want to ask their question. So I think we should get to our group in Freehold, New Jersey. Let me get their microphone on. Where is it? There it is. How are we doing, Freehold? Excellent. We're ready for you, bud.
My name is Angelo, and what is the biggest robotic you've seen?
Ooh. The biggest robot I've seen. Well, I'm in Silicon Valley area, and there are a bunch of autonomous cars driving around. They're test vehicles. They still have drivers in them. But some people would call that a robot in some way. Those are the size of a car, at least. Even, spaceships and rockets, those have elements of robotics on them too. They're not fully robotic, but they have a lot of automatic sensors and circuits. So I would say that's a big robot. The biggest ones I've seen for underwater would probably be ones I've seen from the oil and gas industry. They have robots to inspect pipelines on the seafloor, to create maps of pipelines on the seafloor. Yeah, and those are about the size of, some of them are the size of a small building. Yeah. I worked at CERN for a little bit, and we had the particle accelerator was a giant ring that was under Geneva and the cities nearby. So it was as big as a city really, but underground. And people always say, wow, that is such a giant piece of equipment. But the researchers there, would say, well, it's very small on the scale of the universe, which is what they were studying, the fundamental nature of the universe. And with the ocean too, since the ocean is so giant, I think even a robot or a piece of technology the size of a house is pretty small on the scale of the broader ocean.
All right, absolutely. So we're going to duck onto YouTube to grab a question. We've got sixth graders at Tecumseh North, and they have a question that I think is a really good one. We connected, this was years ago in Mission 31. We talked to Fabien, I think the day before you came down to the bottom of the ocean to start your time as an aquanaut, and he was complaining a little bit about the food. So this class wants to know, what's the food like as an aquanaut, and did you get any fresh deliveries?
Ooh, was this class with us on Mission 31?
I don't think so. It just
made me
think of when we talked to Fabien that one time.
Yeah, because we had to, I think one of the great things about the expedition was we were Skyping with classrooms almost every day from the habitat. And we Skyped with Joe's classroom, and that was a great way to get perspective on what we were doing and to hear some really good questions. The food was, I wasn't complaining. I had just graduated from college, so I'm used to like microwaved meals. I didn't have as refined a palate as, say, Fabien, who's French and has very good taste. We ate a lot of freeze-dried foods, similar to what an astronaut would eat, like camping foods. One of my favorites was this spaghetti. It just came in a foil bag, and I'd add hot water. It looked like powder if you looked into it, and then I'd add water, and it would all puff up and become spaghetti. I thought it was pretty good. But we did have some deliveries. We were working with military divers, and they would bring us down supplies. They had a medical doctor come and check in on us. And one time they were able to bring us down pizza, which was a huge hit. Another time they brought down a cake to celebrate one of the habitat technicians' anniversaries for being in the habitat for a number of days. Yeah, it's good. Those are always really special treats.
All right, excellent. Let's go back to a camera classroom. This time we're going to go to, all right, British Columbia, Maple Ridge, British Columbia, grade 5-6 is hanging out with Mrs. Pasiglia. Let me get that microphone turned on. How are you doing, BC?
Hey, BC. See yourself on our screen, top right. There you go.
How far down was the underwater tunnel, and how long did it take to get there?
Ooh, how far was the underwater habitat? That one was, it was about 20 meters or 60 feet on the seafloor. And it was off the coast of the Florida Keys. And it took to get, so you can descend underwater pretty fast to reach the habitat. You just sink to the habitat, and that took maybe a minute. I've gotten to dive really deep for scuba diving, like to 330 feet. And even getting down to that depth took 4 minutes. It's really fast. The slow part is always coming back from the habitat, because it takes us a while for our bodies to acclimatize back to 1 atmosphere of pressure. So from the habitat, because our bodies were saturated with the gases we were breathing at that high pressure, we came up to the surface over 18 hours. We call that period decompression. We weren't actually in the water column for that 18 hours. We were inside the habitat, but the air in the habitat was slowly changing from the high pressure environment to the 1 atmosphere low pressure. And when I dove to 330 feet, we were in the water column. I was only at that deep depth for 10 minutes, and it took almost 2 hours to resurface and go through the decompression process before returning.
All right, good question. Fairfax, Virginia. We've got a group hanging out with Miss Digby. Let me get that microphone turned on. There it is. All right, Virginia, how's it going?
Good. This is Ethan. Right there. That is,
yeah.
Virginia.
All right. So my name is Ethan. My question for you was, what were the partial pressures of the mixtures that you were breathing while you were underwater in the Aquarius?
Oh, great question. Are you a scuba diver?
Yes.
Oh, I could guess from your use of partial pressures. We were breathing air, compressed air, so normal 21% oxygen. And deeper dives, people often add helium to their breathing gas, for example, because our bodies metabolize that differently and you won't get oxygen toxicity. And I've used that on the rebreather dives that I did and deeper dives, but in the habitat, we were breathing regular air.
All right, good question. Mr. Backus and Mrs. Fromm's class, they're hanging out with us in Rochester, Minnesota. Looks like some 5th graders. Let's get that microphone turned on. How we doing, Minnesota?
Hi, I'm Addison, and I'm doing Sylvia.
I'm researching.
I'm researching Sylvia Earle for a class research project, and I want to know if you know her and how dangerous your job is.
Oh, how dangerous. Well, Sylvia, that's amazing. And I have been fortunate to meet Sylvia Earle on a couple of occasions. She came and visited us in the Aquarius underwater habitat. She, at age 80 or so, she scuba dived down to the habitat like a total champ. And she was really excited to be there, excited to hear about all that we're doing. I had so many questions I wanted to ask her, but she really focused on what we were doing. And she was hugely instrumental in keeping the Aquarius habitat alive. It almost lost its funding as a research habitat. I forget when, but several years ago. And she organized an expedition to live and communicate from the habitat. And that was, I think, if not one of the reasons why the habitat is still in existence today. And yeah, she's fantastic. I think also because I'm so thankful for her pioneering work. Because of her, it's not that weird for a female to be an aquanaut, to have lived underwater, to be involved in marine engineering and science. And I'm so thankful to her because it's not so weird, I get to focus on the actual science questions, the actual development of the technology, and I don't have to deal with some barriers. When she was applying to be an aquanaut, she did face barriers just simply because she was a woman, but because she pioneered and showed people that it's totally fine to be a woman living underwater and doing research. She paved the way for a lot of women ahead of her. And then the other question was, how dangerous is my job? I don't think it's that dangerous. I always take calculated risks, and the habitat in particular, being and living under there, was probably less dangerous than walking down the street where you risk like getting hit by a car, or something. We went through an intensive training process. I'd done numerous dives before. We did so much training that we were familiar with all of the emergency protocols for really anything that could possibly go wrong in the habitat. We were prepared to deal with any of those situations, like in our sleep. And we were always in communication with the Navy and with supervisors on board. In my helmet, I always had a radio link to our habitat technison and the crew on the surface. So yeah, I was probably safer than I am walking down the street. And the same is true for other expeditions that I do. We'll do a detailed risk assessment. We make sure we've gone through the correct training and are prepared to deal with any foreseeable situations.
All right, Grace, I think we can get one more question. I'm going to take it from our YouTube community. We're in Anchorage, Alaska, 5th graders at Campbell STEM Elementary, and they're wondering, what is the highlight of your job? What's your favorite thing about what you do?
Oh, my favorite thing. One, I love anytime I get to spend on or near the water, like for fun, being on the beach or getting to dive and collect data. But I could do that even outside of my job, so that's good. Beyond that, I love when something is working. I think when I'm developing technology, sometimes it's frustrating because stuff doesn't work. Like say I'm trying to I was doing something to pull the numbers off of a sonar screen, and it just wasn't working. It was pulling out bad data. It was not working, and I felt bad. I thought, oh, this is so frustrating. Will it ever work? But then once it started working, it was the best feeling. Like that's the feeling that I'm working towards always. And it's probably sweeter because of all the times that it didn't work. And I probably kind of live for those moments like throughout my job, even as it's getting rough. I wait for that really good feeling when something's finally working.
All right, awesome. Well, let's start off with a huge thank you to the YouTube community. Thanks for sending us in some awesome questions and tuning in today. Obviously, a huge thank you to our live classrooms from Canada and the US. Always great to see your faces. And Grace, thank you so much for hanging out with us today, sharing your story. No doubt there's some students here who want to go out and find some new species of their own or make a really cool robot ocean explorer that can help us find some of those mysteries down there and understand our planet a little better.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. Thank you for organizing this, and all of the classroom's questions were really excellent. Thank you all. All
right, last thing we'll do, let's get those microphones turned on. Let's get loud, boys and girls. A big goodbye and thank you for Grace before we sign off for today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody, for hanging out. Lots of events next week that you can check out. We hope to see some of your classrooms again. Grace, thank you so much. We'll continue following your adventures, and I hope everybody has a great week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. You too. Bye, Joe.